Ever get that feeling like you're, you know, tiptoeing around online, afraid to say the wrong thing?
Oh, yeah.
Like Big Brother's always watching. Or I guess it's more like big algorithm these days, right?
Yeah, you're not wrong about that.
But anyway,
Yeah.
that's what we're diving into today. It's Google's advertising policies and how they're messing with podcasts. You wouldn't believe the stuff they're flagging.
It's really interesting how these policies, like, on the surface, they seem all neutral and objective.
Right.
But the way they actually play out, it can be so subjective. Like, who gets to be heard and who gets silenced online?
Seriously. It's not even always outright censorship. It's these little nudges. You know,
Right.
you can say whatever you want, theoretically, but
Right.
then, bam,
Yeah.
you're demonetized or buried in search results.
Exactly. And that's where it gets dangerous, because then creators start second-guessing themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Self-censoring, just to stay on the algorithm's good side.
Right. And that's just as bad as censorship in a way. I mean,
Absolutely. It stifles creativity. It
Yeah.
limits critical thinking. It narrows the range of perspectives that people are even exposed to.
okay. So let's get into the weeds here. Our first case study. A podcast about MDMA. You'd think, with all the talk about psychedelics these days.
Right.
You'd think so.
This wouldn't be a big deal.
It would seem like harm reduction.
Yeah.
Providing information so people can make informed choices.
Exactly. And that's exactly what this podcast was doing. Super cautious, emphasizing responsible use, highlighting the risks, all that. But guess what?
What happened?
Google banned their ads, said they were promoting drug content,
Wow.
or even like dispensing medical advice.
Isn't that ironic, though? The podcast is trying to prevent harm and they get penalized.
Right.
But you can find tons of content online that actually glamorizes drug use, and nobody bats an eye.
It makes you wonder how they're even applying these policies. Like, is there a human involved at all?
Seriously.
It's like the algorithm completely misses the nuance,
Mhm.
okay? But case study number 2. This one's even wilder. This one actually kind of hits close to home for me. It's a podcast about Elon Musk and the whole oligarch thing. Oligarchs. Interesting.
Yeah. But to be clear, this wasn't about elections or anything like that. It was more of a critical look at his power and influence. You know, whether his wealth and control over companies like Tesla and SpaceX, I mean, does that make him an oligarch?
It's a valid question,
Yeah.
especially with all the concerns about wealth inequality these days.
For sure. And the timing is important here. This was after the election. Musk isn't in office. The podcast wasn't promoting any candidates or parties. It was purely about his role in society.
Okay.
But get this. Google refused to promote the podcast.
Why?
Said it violated their election policy.
policy.
I was like, what election? The guy wasn't even on the ballot.
That's weird, to apply an election policy to a conversation about a private citizen.
Right. It's such a stretch. It makes you wonder if they're just using these policies to silence any discussion they don't like.
Yeah. It's like you can't even talk about certain people or topics without setting off alarm bells.
It's scary, right? Who gets to decide what we're allowed to see and hear online?
That's the big question. And what happens when it's all decided by algorithms that don't understand context or nuance?
Exactly.
It's worth thinking about the power dynamics here. You know, these tech companies, they have so much control over the flow of information online, and their choices about what to promote and what to suppress, that has a huge impact on how the public sees things, how we debate things.
It is unsettling. Like, who's really in control here?
Right?
And what happens when those decisions are being made by algorithms that can't even understand what we're really saying?
Yeah, that's the question we need to keep asking, because our access to information, it's increasingly controlled by these platforms. We need to understand how they work. And we need to demand more transparency and accountability from the people who run them. Makes you think, about how much power these tech companies really have over what we see online. And it's not always like blatant censorship.
Right. That's easy to spot.
Exactly. It's more subtle, like how the algorithms work or these shady advertising policies. That's the sneaky stuff.
Yeah, because it makes you second guess yourself.
Yeah.
Like, is this joke going to get me flagged?
Yeah.
Or that comment? Or even just posting something I'm interested in?
It's like you said earlier, self-censorship.
Yeah.
You start policing yourself before the algorithm even has to.
And it just gets worse and worse.
Yeah.
Right. The more we do it, the less we're willing to push the boundaries or challenge anything or say what we really think.
Exactly. And that's how you end up with this online world that's so sanitized and boring. You know, it's less diverse, less interesting, and honestly less democratic.
It's like that saying, the devil's greatest trick was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Right.
But in this case, it's the algorithms making us think they don't control what we see.
It's that illusion of control makes them even more powerful, because if you don't even realize you're being manipulated,
Right.
you're not going to fight back.
So we've got these two examples, the MDMA podcast and the Elon Musk one,
Right.
which seem kind of random at first,
Oh, that's fair.
but they're part of a much bigger trend. Algorithms controlling what we see, and maybe even trying to silence certain voices.
Yeah.
And it's not just online either, is it?
It's everywhere. And this whole thing with the Washington Post and the LA Times
Yeah.
not endorsing Kamala Harris in the 2024 election, that's a perfect example.
What was so weird, even people who aren't into politics were like, what's going on?
It's not normal. Those papers, they usually endorse candidates. It's like a tradition.
Yeah.
So for them to just sit this one out, especially with the possibility of another Trump term, it felt like they were preemptively obeying something.
Obeying in advance. That's
Yeah.
what we were talking about earlier. Like they were afraid to criticize Trump or endorse his opponent.
And remember, this was all happening when Trump was getting more and more authoritarian with his rhetoric. I mean, attacking the media all the time, calling any criticism fake news.
Right. Even threatening to revoke broadcasting licenses.
It was scary. So you can kind of see why some media outlets wouldn't want to poke the bear.
Especially if they were worried about their profits
Um,
or the safety of their journalists.
It's a tough spot because on one hand, they have a duty to speak truth to power, but on the other hand, they have to think about the consequences.
Right. What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to their employees?
This is something a lot of people are struggling with these days, not just in media, but in academia, the arts, everywhere.
Yeah.
How do you balance free speech with the fear of getting punished for it?
Hard question. And there's no easy answer. I guess it depends on your situation, how much risk you're willing to take.
But the important thing is that we're having this conversation,
Right?
acknowledging how complicated it is, because if we don't talk about it, nothing's going to change.
Yeah. The more we talk about it, the more aware people become.
Yeah.
And maybe we can actually find some solutions.
Solutions that protect free speech, but also protect people from harm.
Because like we're living in this crazy world where we have all this information at our fingertips, but it's hard to know what to believe.
Right. It's like the irony of the digital age.
Totally. We're drowning in data, but starving for actual wisdom. You know?
It's like we're constantly bombarded with stuff, but it's all out of context.
Yeah.
Filtered through these algorithms, who knows what's real anymore?
It's exhausting. So how do we even navigate this mess? Like, how do we protect ourselves? How do we even think for ourselves when there are all these forces trying to tell us what to think?
Well, I think it starts with remembering that we're not just passive sponges soaking it all up.
Yeah.
We can think for ourselves. We have the power to choose what we consume and how we engage with it.
So it's not just about knowing there's a problem. It's about doing something about it. But what can we actually do?
Well, one thing that can help is cultivating intellectual humility.
Humility.
Yeah. Basically recognizing that we don't have all the answers. You know, our own perspective, it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Humility. That's a tough one these days, especially online. Everyone's so sure they're right about everything.
It is. But if we're always digging in our heels, refusing to even consider other viewpoints, we'll never learn or grow.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And I guess that ties into being more curious, too.
Exactly. Curiosity is like the antidote to dogma. If we're genuinely interested in learning and exploring new ideas, we're less likely to get sucked into the echo chamber.
So we need to be more curious, more humble, and more picky about the information we consume. But what about the stuff we create ourselves? How do we make sure our own voices are heard in all this noise?
One thing we can do is support the creators and journalists who are actually trying to tell the truth, even when it's hard or unpopular.
Yeah, subscribe to their stuff.
Yeah.
Share it. Donate if you can. Let them know their work matters.
Exactly, because if we want a healthy media landscape, we got to actively support the voices we want to hear.
And we got to be mindful of our own behavior online, too. Right? Like, are we spreading misinformation? Are we just talking to people who agree with us all the time?
Those are important questions to ask ourselves.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the outrage and forget that words have power. They can actually hurt people.
It's a good reminder to stop and think about the impact we're having online. Are we contributing to the problem, or are we part of the solution?
It all comes back to personal responsibility. We can't just blame the algorithms for everything.
Right, we have to hold ourselves accountable. And we have to hold those platforms accountable, too. We need more transparency, more fairness, and a genuine commitment to creating an online world where everyone feels welcome and respected.
It's a big ask, but it's not impossible, right? We've seen people come together online to fight censorship, demand better from these tech companies.
Exactly. And those movements are growing. More and more people are realizing that the internet, it's not some neutral playground. It's shaped by power and algorithms that don't always have our best interests at heart.
It's a battle for the soul of the internet, and the stakes are high, because the future of free speech, our democracy, our ability to connect with each other in a meaningful way. It all depends on how this plays out.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a sense of hope and a sense of power. We can make a difference. We have the tools, the knowledge, and the collective will to create a better digital world. It starts with each of us, with the choices we make online and offline.
So let's choose wisely. Let's choose to be informed and engaged and compassionate. Let's choose to amplify the voices of truth and justice. Let's never stop believing that we can make a difference together.
Beautifully said. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing for a better world.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.